Greetings on behalf of the trustees of the Deaconess Foundation and the board of directors of the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing. My name is Sue Steepleton. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces in the crowd today. Most of my life, career, volunteer, and et cetera, has been about advocating for children and their families at the policy level and other levels. And it's my honor currently to serve as vice president of the board of the Deaconess Center. The honor and duty of governance for Deaconess is also a joy because it's shared among so many wonderful community and civic leaders. And I wonder if all the current or former members of the Deaconess Board of Trustees and the Center Board would stand and be recognized. Don't be shy, they're going to be here. And thanks to all of you. Thanks every one of you as well for joining us for today's community conversation. Last year when we opened Deaconess Center, and I want to say before I go on with the prepared remarks, I heard Starsky or somebody say just last week there have been 11,000 people in this building just this year. It's amazing. If there, absolutely. If there was ever validation of the need for a building like this, in this space, in this location, with the kind of policies that allow great access for even those who can't pay big hotel fees to have meetings. So excuse my editorializing, but there we are. When we opened the Deaconess Center, we began to introduce it to the region through a series of what we've called Just for Kids community conversations, with thought leaders aligned with our approach to building a community just for kids. That approach includes making sure children, parents, and child advocates are directly and deeply engaged in democratic processes that impact their lives. So today's dialogue about healthy democracy operating on the national and local levels is an important one for our work for St. Louis's children. When reviewing the registration list, we were pleased to note that there are a few elected and appointed leaders who chose to join us to talk about this important topic. And would those folks please stand and be recognized? Elected and appointed officials, by any definition. Come on, some of you are shy, but that's all right. Thank you for your leadership. Finally, I'd like to welcome Joe Goldman to St. Louis and Justin Hansford back to St. Louis. We look forward to hearing what you have to say and wrestling with what it means for St. Louis, for our region, and for our children. Thank you. Starsky?
Good deal. Thanks, Sue. Thanks again to all of you for being with us. Really excited and delighted to continue this conversation. I was sharing with Joe earlier that this is kind of our democracy series, if you will, this year. Last month we had with us the president of New America. Today, of course, the leader of Democracy Fund and Democracy Fund Voice, who I'll introduce in a moment, and Joe. And then next month we'll welcome Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners. And as much as philanthropy, innovation, and faith are critical elements of how we live democracy in America, we thought these were important voices to bring to our community. So we invite you, we're glad you're here today. We invite you to join us again on December 9th when we gather again in this space with Jim Wallace. I wanted to take a moment to thank just a few folks for being here today and encourage you to let folks know that you are here. So social sharing, there are all of these wonderful hashtags, and there'll be them later. So if you want to share what's going on in the room, the Just for Kids hashtag, the Healthy Democracy hashtag, and also the handles on Twitter and Instagram for Joe and Justin. We didn't know how far they'd go, so we put their personal handles here so they didn't have to implicate their organizations if they didn't want to. Let you know also we are recording today so that this session is made available to our friends and colleagues who can't be here and will be posted on the Deaconess Center website. I also wanted to walk briefly through kind of how we're going to be moving today. So I hope you had a time to meet someone that you did not know during our breakfast time, to catch up with somebody. I got a chance to tell someone, hey, I need to talk to you about such and such. Did everybody catch up with somebody they needed to catch up with? Okay. All right. Did you meet somebody that you did not know? All right, so we're glad that you started your Monday morning on what may be a busy week with a chance to slow down, have some decent breakfast, maybe have more than the smoothie you would have had otherwise, to be able to have it in community with friends and to connect with some new folks. That said, after that time, we've made our transition. We'll have our community conversation in here, beginning with Joe's presentation about some of the things that you may have already received ahead of time, and then going to a response from Justin, talking about the implications for justice and equity. And we'll have some opportunity then to engage in conversation as a community together, both as one large dialogue, but also some small dyads and triads. And we're going to leave by 11 o'clock. And so we will do all of that and be thoughtful about how we move together. Finally, I wanted to, before giving this introduction, I want to thank both our partners in the room, those who are funded partners of Deaconess, those who are center-based initiatives, which mean you convene in this space regularly and have committed to making it a home base for your work, or those who are advocacy partners on the field. If you meet any of those definitions, you hang out with Deaconess on a pretty regular basis in any of those areas, would you just wave at me? Thank you very much. For those who are not yet, you're sitting next to somebody who does, and they're going to get you by the time this time is over. Finally, I wanted to thank the staff team for Deaconess, the folks who have made it possible for you to receive hospitality today and whom you may have already met. So I'll go around the room back in that corner trying to figure out whatever's next or whatever the heck I may be throwing at them. David Neret Flores, who's the director of the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing. Michael Schultz, who's our program assistant and was first line of communication with many of you for today. In the back, Matt O'Danny, our Vice President of Operations, who oversees the facility, finance, and HR, so you make sure that all the checks we write are good. Our partners really love Matt. Constance Rush, our advocacy director who leads communications and makes sure that we are ruffling the right feathers at the right time. And Keisha Davis, our director of partnership and capacity building, is there. She's the one who makes sure that the resources get to the right folks. And as if he knew that I was going to call his name, just coming in the door is Cassell Williams. Cassell is our maintenance coordinator here at the center, making sure that all things here are nice and that this investment in community remains a valuable one. I don't see him in the room, but perhaps greeting you at the front desk was Reverend Aaron Rogers. He's the guy who keeps me in line, biggest job in the house. And so we're grateful for their support and the remarkable work that they do. If you would, help me in thanking the Deaconess team. So the center is here really in order to create space for these community convenings. As we get into the rooting for today, talk about healthy democracy, there's a gentleman by the name of Eric Kleinenberg who wrote a book called Palaces for the People. And part of what he talks about is the need for creation of space to advance social cohesion in order for democracy and society to work well together. And he didn't publish that book until earlier this year, and I didn't meet him till this summer. But I said, oh, that's what we were doing. Really in the context as we began to think about our strategy at Deaconess and began to live through one of the perhaps most critical points of engaged civic democracy in our community in a long time through the Ferguson Uprising, we began to recognize how much the community needed space, how much our partners who are doing work aligned with our public policy agenda needed to be able to convene and connect with one another. And you can't do all of that online. And so we decided that we would reach out to some of our closest partners, create a new building for ourselves to engage and be in a community, to edge out development in a place that people really thought was important, like Grand Center, and connect it to a neighborhood that we thought was really important, like the Vanderventer neighborhood. And at these types of formally dividing lines and empty spaces, we could perhaps have a connective space. And we're glad that you all have come into this space. So thanks, Daryl, for the prompt. Now I'm going to do my job before I start talking too much, because I'm a preacher. I can do that. We're very glad to have a couple of friends with us today. I'll share from their formal bios in the interest of caring introduction for all the remarkable work that they do. First, we'll hear from our keynote for today, Joe Goldman. Joe is both the president of Democracy Fund and Democracy Fund Voice. The Democracy Fund is a bipartisan foundation working to ensure that our political system is able to withstand new challenges and deliver on its promise to the American people. Previously, Joe was an investment director at the Omidyar Network, where he incubated the Democracy Fund for 3 years. Joe has spent his career working to strengthen democratic institutions through public deliberation and policy reform. Previously, he was vice president of citizen engagement at America Speaks, where he directed and facilitated large-scale public deliberations across the country, including the unified New Orleans planning process after Hurricane Katrina and the redevelopment of the World Trade Center site after 9/11. Joe has written extensively about the theory and practice of deliberative democracy and spoken about the value of public deliberation in venues across the world. He has also engaged the public inside government. He managed Mayor Anthony Williams' Neighborhood Action Initiative in Washington, D.C., which engaged thousands of residents in shaping the city's budget priorities. Neighborhood Action was named Program of the Year by the International Association of Public Participation. Joe also managed the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission's Common Ground Regional Planning Process in Chicago, which later received the Outstanding Planning Award from the American Planning Association for its innovative use of technology and broad community outreach. Joe was a public service fellow at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, where he received a master's degree in public policy, graduated with honors in political science from Vassar College. The Democracy Fund Voice is a nonpartisan organization established in 2014 to conduct and support advocacy that will produce stronger, healthier democracy in the United States. Democracy Fund Voice is a C4 nonprofit organization and a sister to Democracy Fund, a private foundation that fosters the highest ideals of the American Republic, government of, by, and for the people. Please welcome Joe Goldman. And in the interest of continuing conversation, so I don't have to get back up, I'll introduce Justin Hansford, or reintroduce to many in this community, Justin Hansford, professor of law at Howard University's Law School and director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. Justin Hansford is on the faculty there at Howard as Associate Professor of Law and Executive Director of the Civil Rights Center named for Thurgood Marshall. He previously served as a Democracy Project Fellow at Harvard University, a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University's Law Center, and an Associate Professor of Law at St. Louis University. He has a BA from Howard University, a JD from Georgetown Law Center, where he was founder of the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. Professor Hansford has also received a Fulbright Scholar Award to study the legal career of Nelson Mandela and served as a clerk for Judge Damon Keith on the United States Court of Appeals of the Sixth Circuit. Professor Hansford is a leading scholar and activist in the areas of critical race theory, human rights, and law and social movements. He is the co-author of the forthcoming 7th edition of Race, Racism, and American Law, the celebrated legal textbook that was the first case book published specifically for teaching race-related law courses. His interdisciplinary scholarship has appeared in academic journals in various universities, including Harvard, Georgetown, Fordham, and the University of California, Hastings. As many of you know, in the wake of the killing of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri, Hansford worked to empower the Ferguson community through community-based legal advocacy. He co-authored the Ferguson to Geneva Human Rights Shadow Report and accompanied Ferguson protesters, including Michael Brown's family, to Geneva, Switzerland, to testify at the United Nations. He has served as a policy advisor for the proposed post-Ferguson reforms at local, state, and federal levels, testifying before the Ferguson Commission, the Missouri Advisory Committee to the United States Civil Rights Commission, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He hang out with protesters. That's what I said. That's it. Please welcome back to St. Louis, Justin Hansford. I invite both of our speakers to come. After Joe's presentation, Justin will respond, and then we'll get into conversation with one another. Joe.
Thank you. So thank you, Starsky. Really appreciate your inviting me out here. Should note, Starsky didn't mention, he's a member of our National Advisory Committee and has been a great friend to our organization for the last couple of years. Also wanted to recognize Robin Carnahan is somewhere around the room. Oh, there she is, who's also been a co-chair of our National Advisory Committee. We are glad to have these two remarkable leaders anchoring us here in the St. Louis area. What I was hoping to do relatively briefly, and I'll turn on my stopwatch to make sure I keep it relatively brief, is kind of talk a little bit about the relationship between justice and democracy and how we need to think about our role as kind of taking responsibility for achieving both, especially during this strange, important, terrifying time for our country. And so what I thought I'd do is kind of make kind of 4 propositions. And I can kind of run through them quickly and then go through them one by one. And kind of hope that sets us up for a kind of conversation as a community. So my first proposition is, if you care about justice, you have to care about democracy. Because you can't have a just society unless you have a vibrant, healthy, liberal democracy. Second, at this point in time, our democracy is in a state of crisis, and we all need to feel a responsibility to do something about it. My third proposition is that these next 12 months are going to play a remarkable role in the future of our country. And for those of us who work for nonpartisan institutions, whether it's within government, within nonprofit organizations, we cannot sit on the sidelines during this moment. We need to find ways, nonpartisan ways, to do our part to make sure that this election cycle does a better job living up to our ideals for a healthy democracy. And finally, no matter what outcome we see from this election cycle, the work's not going to be over. Our democracy has been broken for some time. It's going to still be regardless of the outcome, and we all need to be ready for a long journey. So let me start with the first. And I had no intention of kind of starting here, but a group of us had dinner last night, and it kind of came up in conversation. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about kind of how to think about the relationship between justice and democracy in a way that hopefully is not terribly academic or kind of anchored in political theory or philosophy, but, you know, acknowledging, right, we live in a deeply unjust society, and it is simply inadequate to rely on seemingly fair institutions, fair processes, if the outcome is unjust, right? I think we can all agree on that point. But at the same time, we need to care about what a healthy democracy looks like, because the procedural legitimacy that it produces allows for a just society to be maintained, right? A just society without justice is a mockery of our values. But justice without a just process threatens the legitimacy of the society we build together and must live in together, right? We need to care about what it means to create a just society, but we also need to care about what it means to create and maintain an open society, right? We need a free press. We need fair elections. We need the rule of law, civil rights, functioning institutions of government, checks and balances. These kinds of things make sure that all of us have a stake in the future of our society and our democracy. And when we look at what is threatened today, it is not just about the unjust outcomes that we're producing. It is about the attacks on the mechanisms of our democracy that we need to maintain over time, right? And that takes me to kind of my second point, that right now our democracy is in a state of crisis, and we all need to care about that. I don't think this is the most controversial statement to make. I think we all kind of feel it. We recently actually funded a poll of 6,500 Americans, and we kind of asked them an array of questions about their kind of attitudes towards democracy. One of the questions we asked, which I found fascinating, was kind of what emotion do you kind of identify with our democracy today? Unsurprisingly, less than 30% identified with emotions like hopeful or enthusiastic. Not too surprising. 57% said that anxious was a word that described how they're feeling right now. 62% said the word sad describes how they're feeling right now. 67% said angry was the word that really felt right. The word that got the highest response, that the most people responded to, was disgusted. So people get that our democracy is not serving them well. They don't necessarily know what to do about it, but they get that there's something deeply wrong. And this is not all or even primarily about Donald Trump, right? This is something that's been here for some time. It'll be here for some time. But I do want to kind of take a minute to talk a little bit about what does it mean to have an authoritarian in the White House who has very little respect for democratic norms and institutions, right? So I think background reading was sent around. I don't know if anybody actually read it, but a report written by a woman named Rachel Kleinfeld at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace. So we commissioned that report about a year or two ago, in part because I was deeply concerned that we were kind of in uncharted territory as a country. And I didn't really know what to do about it. And so, like, what do you do when you're in uncharted territory? You look for a map, right? In this case, there are only two places you can look. You can look to history, or you can look to other cases, other countries, and how they've dealt with these kinds of problems. And so my request to Rachel was, all right, show me countries that have gone through the experience of democratic backsliding, right, have gone through the process of a degradation of democratic norms and institutions. Tell me how they came back. So there were a few things that, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. I think it's a really good report. There are three things that really stand out for me about it, right? So the first was the researchers had a lot of trouble with my core request, right? They had a lot of trouble finding case studies where you actually had countries that have gone through some form of democratic backsliding and came back, right? They struggled with the positive story. And the underlying message there was, once you start degrading democratic norms and institutions, it's really hard to get them back, right? In the cases that they found, it often took years and decades to recover, and even then, it was still an unfinished recovery, right? And so when we see democratic norms and institutions being degraded, that's a problem because it's really hard to get them back. The second thing that stood out for me was that there were a number of institutions and norms that were kind of the bellwethers of how likely it is to be able to recover. And in almost all of the cases for those bellwether institutions, we are seeing deep threats and pressure on those institutions, right? A couple that stood out for me, right? The civil service. An independent civil service is a deeply important thing. And what's happening in Washington right now? The testimony of these independent civil servants who saw themselves as outside of politics having to testify in impeachment hearings because their work was threatened, right? The notion that a whistleblower may become a politicized thing, may become an attacked thing from the President of the United States, that's a dangerous phenomenon. The independence of the courts is another kind of thing, right? And what have we seen over the last couple of years? We've seen this White House and this Senate time and time again pushing through new judges to put them into the system, often folks who are unqualified for the role. And what does that mean for kind of the future of justice in this country? The third lesson is, for me, the more optimistic thing, in the hopes of not totally bumming you out. This is my challenge these days, is like to go to cocktail parties and like not depress everyone in the room. So you're going to bring them back up. So to me, the third lesson, the third thing that really stood out, right, is that the most important kind of mechanism for maintaining the democracy and helping it recover is a robust civil society and free press. Right, and that for me is the positive story of the last few years, the degree to which civil society, civic organizations, activist organizations have been vibrant and active and speaking truth to power, right? And the degree to which even the press has played important roles to that end. And, you know, for me, like, so as the president of a foundation who works on these issues, we have invested in whistleblower protection and government oversight and investigative journalism and those kinds of things. But we can all be part of keeping our civil society vibrant and ensuring that we are standing up in these moments of threat. So my third point, my third argument I want to make is that the next 12 months are going to be remarkably important for this country. I don't think I need to go into too much detail about why, but we are entering a historic election period. And, you know, I think for a lot of folks who work for nonprofits, who work for government, even business leaders, it's a little hard to figure out in these kinds of moments what your role is. And, you know, my request is you got to get over it, right? That as somebody who has run a foundation that really tries to build relationships across the aisle, right? We've worked really hard to do so. We cannot sit on the sidelines over these next 12 months. And I want to offer kind of three nonpartisan priorities that we all need to work towards. And I think there are ways that we can all contribute to. Right, so the first is we need to make sure that the electorate in 2020 is representative of the American people. That means supporting civic engagement for young people and communities of color, disenfranchised communities. This election is going to determine the future of this country, and the future of this country needs to be represented at the ballot box. At the Democracy Fund, that means investing in organizations that are fighting voter suppression. It means investing in organizations that are supporting voter registration and turnout. And for everybody here, regardless of whether you work in government or business or nonprofits, there are roles that you can play towards this goal and making sure it's achieved. For me, the second goal needs to be ensuring that our system of elections actually has the capacity to handle historic levels of participation, right? Every piece of data that I see suggests that people are paying attention to this election from both sides of the aisle at record levels. We're going to see more people vote than we've ever seen before. That's going to put remarkable pressure on our systems of election administration. And put that in the context of cyber attacks and other concerns about the integrity of the process. We need to make sure that the system can handle this election such that we can truly trust in the results, right? And so for us at the Democracy Fund, that has meant investing, we've used our C4 to advocate for more resources from Congress to get down to local jurisdictions. But we also need to make sure that local jurisdictions are getting the resources they need from the county, from the state, to do their jobs, right? We've invested in training of election officials, running kind of war game scenario planning for cyber attacks, those kinds of things. Everybody here, you can be a poll worker. You can recruit a poll worker. You can make sure that you're in conversation with local and state government to demand that enough resources are being made available to ensure that when it comes down to election day, we have no questions about who the winner was, right? For me, the third priority is about misinformation and fear-mongering, right? We need to do everything that we can to prevent it from swaying voters, right? We all know the 2016 story. We all know what happened in 2016. It's going to be far more intense in 2020. The story that I think everybody is not necessarily aware of is that in 2016, the communities that were most attacked online, right, where the misinformation was targeted, it was targeted at women, it was targeted at communities of color, right? And if we want just outcomes, we need to care about these kinds of issues. And for us, that means supporting organizations like Color of Change and Free Press that are pushing on the social media companies to do the right thing. It also means supporting journalism, right? And we all need to do our part in making sure that journalists have the resources they need to do their job in this time. So my last proposition, right, is that regardless of the outcome of this election, the game ain't over, right? this is a long process, and we need to make sure that we're not just paying attention to the health of our democracy when election time comes around, right? When election time is over, we're going to get into redistricting, right? We're going to get into an array of questions that have to do with how our system of government works. And I think we all need to be paying attention and be ready for that long fight. So I want to kind of close there and maybe leave with a quote that I like from an early Federalist leader, a guy named Fisher Ames, who I actually know very little about. But he had a quote, he was talking about kind of why democracy is important and comparing it to kind of monarchy, right? That was kind of his frame of reference. And his quote was, "So monarchy is like a sleek craft. It sails smoothly along until some bumbling captain runs it onto the rocks. Democracy, on the other hand, is like a leaky raft. It never goes down," he said, "but damn it, your feet are always wet." So lately our feet have felt pretty wet, but we've seen that when people come out, when they turn out, when they participate, when they care, we stay afloat and we get closer to where we want to go. And I think that's what this is about. And you know, I look forward to working with you all in rowing ashore. So, Justin, yeah.